Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
I'm particularly pleased that we've got with us tonight representatives from three quite distinct religious traditions: Christian, Muslim and Buddhist. So we're in for a very interesting conversation, I'm sure. When our three panellists have spoken, I'll then invite our earlier speakers, Paul and Anne, to join us on the platform, at which point there will be a general Q&A session. So let me begin by introducing our three speakers. Tim Cooper is Professor of Sustainable Design and Consumption at Nottingham-Trent University. I won't tell you everything about his CV, you can read it in the blurb, but he has advised and done research for European institutions as well as national governments in various countries. He's also the co-founder, was the co-founder of Christian Ecology back in 1982, one of the earliest Christian organised initiatives in this area, and wrote a book called Green Christianity, published in 1990. Mawil Izzi Dien is a reader in Islamic Studies at the University of Wales, Trinity St David. He has a particular interest in law, faith and the environment, interfaith engagement and Islamic economics, and is currently co-editing a book entitled Islamic Economics in the Contemporary World. And on my left, Laszlo Zsolnai is Professor and Director of the Business Ethics Centre at the Corvinus University of Budapest. He's co-founder of the Buddhist Economics Research Platform, and he's the author of far too many books even to list on a wide range of areas relevant to economic growth and sustainability. So we're delighted to present these three panelists for you tonight. So now we're going to hand over to Tim Cooper, and the three of us here are going to move down to the chair so we can actually see what he's going to say.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for inviting me to say a few words in response to Paul and Anne. Paul and I go back a long way together. I can remember coming across Paul in my early days as a member of what was then called the Ecology Party, where I was given a degree of undue deference as someone with an economics degree by Paul, who at the time I think already had an engineering degree, but then later went on and got an economics degree, so then had two degrees, so that trumped me. But we had so many happy days discussing how on earth one could actually use the model of sustainability and somehow bring the economy on board. And perhaps today we're finding out just how far we have or haven't come. I'm also delighted to meet with Pettifor as well, because actually I am a former employee of the Economics Foundation back in the early 1990s and did my early research before I took off on my academic career as a researcher at ABS. So it's a delight to be able to respond to both of you and say a few words to give you a feel for where I'm coming from in this whole debate. And the starting point is I've got a degree in economics, but I don't call myself an economist because I rather go along with the words of a professor who I remember studying at university, Mark Blau, who wrote in a recent publication, "Modern economics is sick. Economics has increasingly become an intellectual game played for its own sake and not for its practical consequences for understanding the economic world. Economists have converted the subject into a sort of social mathematics in which analytical rigour is everything and practical relevance is nothing." Now, of course, there are some very, very good economists around, including some in present company. But I do subscribe to this idea that certainly mainstream economics has a long way to go to respond, in order to respond to the critique of Mark Blau and those thoughts there. And what he's expressing there is a recognition, I think, in a much wider academic community that economics has, over the past 50 years, gone down a wrong trajectory and has not responded to the global challenges that it ought to be facing today. And there are many reasons for that. I'm only going to touch on one or two of them here. But the general critique of mainstream neoclassical economics is that it's rooted in a scientific worldview. Paul very carefully qualifies his work by saying models offer insights, not truth. And I'm very glad he did that, because that's certainly a critique that many people would have of economics, that they claim things that cannot be claimed as absolute. A second critique of mainstream economics is flawed assumptions. The assumption that people are rational and selfish, they maximise what they call their utility, but they are materialistic, they always want more. That's like inherent in the economist's notion of a consumer. A further assumption is the earth has no intrinsic value. It's an instrumentalist view of the world. The resources are there to other ends. It is not good of itself. And thirdly, and perhaps most profoundly, is that the methods used by mainstream economists are seriously flawed. Their models are unrealistic, and they're biased to quantitative methods, in other words, using numbers and only claiming what measures can matter, is deeply flawed, not least from a Christian perspective. There are, however, a whole range of emerging new schools of economic thought, behavioural, institutional, ecological, that take a different perspective, that start not with money, but start with nature, our surroundings, the idea, the recognition indeed, that nature imposes limits, and that's the starting point for any real understanding of the economy. Moreover, from that economic development must be understood in the context of an interdependence and co-evolution of human-made economies and natural, or I would say God-given ecosystems. Thirdly, this new wave of economics, or counter-economics, if you will, is essentially value-driven. It's normative rather than positive. When I was an undergraduate at university, I remember reading a book called Positive Economics by Lipschitz. Well, that's good, it's not negative. But in fact, what we mean as economists is the positive view, is that it is the view that is rooted in a kind of scientific mindset, whereas the normative view is the understanding and recognition that underlying economics are particular values, choices, preferences, priorities, political choices as much as anything. And lastly, this new wave of economists wouldn't really see economists as a discipline, because they would appreciate that to link in, to fuse economics and ecology or ecosystems, one has to look in terms of different disciplines, different domains of sustainability, the environmental, the economic and the social together, and you can't just be an economist, a new economist if you like, without addressing and absorbing and integrating with other disciplines. I'm going to skip those, but suffice to say, mainstream economics preaches economic growth. We know that, and we know that in its present form is unsustainable. I want instead just to turn briefly to what is implied by that. Paul mentions once or twice that ultimately economics recognises that, economists recognise that growth isn't about well-being. I remember lots of people at Green Party conferences preaching to me that, oh, you all think that economic growth measures well-being. No, we don't. I was taught on day one as an undergraduate, but certainly early on, you're measuring economic activity, as Paul said. Yet a more profound and important concept I think to focus on is well-being or prosperity. And I want to just touch on two different reports that have come out in recent years. The first by Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, and the second by the Sustainable Development Commission. The first was called Prosperity with a Purpose. It came out 6 years ago now, and one of the interesting quotes that emerged, and it's not all bad by any stretch of the imagination, was this one. The thinking of all the mainstream denominations has converged around one key proposition, that under the right conditions, economic growth can serve God's purposes. Now, I think for me, the most profound mistake of that otherwise fairly bland quote is that it refers to growth as the key proposition, as if we have to locate the debate as Christians around economic growth, not around human well-being, human flourishing, human beings' relationship to our God, our Maker and our Saviour. So we may argue for and against whether or not economic growth can serve God's purpose, in what circumstances, in what countries, depending on what, But the bottom line is that the debate on prosperity from a Christian perspective should not be located around numbers, mathematical numbers, as Anne mentioned, economic growth. It should instead be located around human flourishing. So much for CTBI. The next report that came out 3 years later and was developed in his recent book by Tim Jackson, who was one of the commissioners on the Sustainable Development Commission, wrote this: questioning growth is deemed to be the act of lunatics, idealists and revolutionaries, but question it we must. The idea of a non-growing economy may be anathema to the economist, but the idea of a continually growing economy is an anathema to the ecologist. And I do believe that Tim has a profound point there. We can argue, and certainly agree with comments made earlier, that in some ways, whether economic growth is -1% or -0.5% or 0.5% or +0.5%, is a fairly arcane and ultimately futile discussion. It certainly has implications, not least, as Paul said, for employment and unemployment. But the long term is crucial, and the small detail of whether we're getting 0.5% or 1% or 2% growth is less important than the bigger, longer term picture. There are many unresolved tensions, I believe, with any attempt to move to what's been called sustainable growth. And I summarise some of them here. And again, the problem of trying to sell over consumption in an era of austerity as we have now is, of course, deeply problematic. But from a Christian perspective, is one that nonetheless we must face, because as Christians we are not there to be pragmatists to do what seems possible or sensible, but to try and do what's right. And in that sense I come from a fairly idealistic branch of Christianity. There is a large school of thought, and indeed a school of thought which cuts across countries, and it's seen in mainstream governments, that there really are opportunities to move to what's been described as greener growth. And again, they've been touched on in the preceding discussion today. For example, that the move towards improving the productivity of our resource use and energy use and materials use will actually stimulate economic growth. It will help us, because by doing those things, by using resources more efficiently, by using energy more efficiently, we become more competitive, and therefore as a trading nation can therefore expand our economies. Now there are deep, I think, issues there, not least the rebound effect and what we do with the savings we get from so-called resource efficiency. And I wanted to suggest, drawing from my own research, one of the ways in which those tensions might be dealt with. My own area of research has moved beyond looking at macroeconomic models, and I did some econometric work in years gone by that we have to talk about later on, but time presses on. I've drawn a conclusion that at the heart of any move towards a sustainable economy must be a look at the flow, the speed of resources through that economy. And that leads me to conclude that one of the key features of a green economy is a move away from short-lived goods, planned obsolescence and the like, towards an economy where things last much longer. And the reason for that is because the move towards the top of the chart there, efficiency and eco-efficiency, which is supposed to lead to so-called green growth, does have that problem that if you save resources, you still have income. So, for example, the government may encourage me to, for example, get rid of my appliances and buy double-star rated appliances. I may, for example, as someone who has an allotment, have 2 freezers, I've got a fridge freezer and a freezer, and I might save myself £50 a year in electricity bills by that resource efficiency. But the fact remains that I still have that £50. I saw the other day that one of the plane companies, Jets2.com, anyway, they were doing flights to Paris for £49. So I saved my money through my resource efficiency gain, but I chose to spend it on a flight to Paris. So there are issues there with whether eco-efficiency can actually lead us towards the goal of sustainability. And at the same time, another path seen at the bottom there of moving towards sufficiency, slowing down consumption so that we actually consume far less, of course has the threat that we then progress towards a recession, or a deeper recession. Now, the joy and the benefits in terms of the central path, which is increased product lifespans, in other words, longer lasting products, which by the definition are more efficient, because you're perhaps, if you have, for example, a washing machine that lasts for 20 years rather than 10, clearly you're using half the metal and perhaps less energy. And that together with slow consumption, so slowing the throughput of products and services through the economy, I believe can lead us towards sustainable consumption. And it can do that not just because it avoids the problem of the rebound effect, that we spend the savings that we get through increased efficiency, but also the money tends to be located in the domestic economy. As we know, much of our manufacturing is relocated to China and to other countries. And a shift towards increased product longevity would imply, because those products would have to be maintained and serviced and upgraded over time, jobs in those labour-intensive parts of the economy being in this country, and thus helping the domestic economy. Now, I can talk about that at great length. I'm not going to, because I only have a few more minutes left. I want to move next, and to conclude, by trying to draw out a few more strands as to what my Christian faith brings to my study of economics. I want to start by a book, one of the first broad overviews of what a green economic perspective might mean. And it was by Herman Daly and John Cobb, and it was published just over 10 years ago for the common good. And what they concluded at the end was that integrating a faith perspective, and they'd written a pretty chunky book without dwelling too much on Christianity, but they concluded it by saying that actually we need something more than what we described so far. We need a faith perspective. But why do we need this? First of all, they said it's because having a faith in something is a check against idolatry, or what they called misplaced concreteness, which is at the heart of their critique of economics. The check against idolatry. Secondly, it offers a perspective that transcends one's own. In other words, it posits the idea that there is a God, a supreme being, that we can somehow look towards as giving us some kind of guidance, or something that's beyond the mundane of human beings. Thirdly, that it can be a motivator, that it implies some kind of committedness and direct commitment to change for the better. And lastly, that a faith perspective can help us to understand our relation to the future. In other words, it has a teleological perspective. It looks about to the future and tries to shape us in the right direction. So for all those reasons, Daly and Cobb argue that faith is important in this new economics. Specifically from a Christian perspective, and they are both coming from that perspective, one has to ask then, can Christianity help in our goal of trying to progress towards a greener economy, a sustainable development? There is a question mark as to whether or not there is a thing as Christian economics. Certainly there have been books written on the subject, but not many, only a handful that I've come across in recent years, and certainly few from a Christian perspective, so taking into account sustainability. And one of the reasons for that is that Christianity and economics are, in many ways, they are different disciplines, and they are coming to questions and issues using different methods, using different standards of evidence, and indeed conveying and utilising different types of knowledge. And yet, nonetheless, there is, I think, scope for a greater cross-disciplinary relationship between theology and economics, which may take one or more different forms. And people try to explore what is meant by Christian economics have taken one or other or both of these approaches. The one may be looking at our mainstream economics and just trying to draw upon what would usually or broadly be called Christian ethics and apply those to the current economic system. Another might, or indeed an alternative economic system. Another might be to look at specific biblical texts to try and explore what economic theories might say and help us to understand the meaning of those texts. So there are, I believe, different ways in which Christianity, or theology and economics can operate together. And I just summarised a few. We could spend an evening, or will we spend an evening or more, talking about some of these things. So it may be simple things, such as should we keep the Sabbath? And of course the church was very essential to trying to retain the Sabbath against the Sunday trading laws back in the 1980s. And has very eloquently talked about the importance of going back to the Old Testament and looking at usury. And the church could oppose usury. And it could also seek to have brought other principles, and one might try and think, well, what would an economy rooted in Christian principles look like? What would happen if we all sought to restrain our consumption patterns? When I go to the large shopping centre outside Sheffield, where I live, commonly called Meadow Hall, which is locally known as Meadow Hell, you look around and you see the window shopping that goes on, and the temptations that corrupt the people there, and think to yourself, well, what would happen to Meadow Hall if we all went back that evening, read 1 Timothy 6 verse 8, and said if we have food and clothes, we'll be content with that? What would then happen to the investment in the Meadow Hall shopping centre? And indeed, there are other interesting issues about generosity, and someone could ask, what would be the implications of giving away more of our money to the third world, for example, in terms of development patterns. Other broad principles that could be applied. What if we took creation care really seriously as the church? And how much of a battle has it been in the Church of England, in which I spend a good deal of my time? So to think about their carbon footprint, and why has it taken so long for the church to get engaged in the carbon footprint debate? And why did it wake up so late to sustainability? What about issues of social justice? Acting justly and walking humbly with our Lord in Micah. And of course the principle of work being a good, it should be a good thing. So I think there are a lot of insights that we can get from the Christian faith that we can apply in the context of sustainability and the future of the economy. And I'm going to skip these because we're talking about consumption tomorrow, but I'm going to end with just a few thoughts here. Most of my work is done in the broad area of sustainable consumption, and it's problematic. How do you change people? And I think Paul was wrestling with this at the end of his presentation, that ultimately people don't want to consume less. What do we do in a free society to encourage necessary change? And consumer behaviour theorists use range of different models, but most of them bring together the 3 areas: attitudes, motivation and opportunities. And I think that the church can play an interesting role in each of those. The first is that attitudes affect our behaviour. What we think is good and bad, what is right and wrong, what we feel is the right way to go, affects clearly what we do when we go to the shops, or if we go to the shops. And in Rowan Williams' sermon he gave a couple of years ago on the environment, he noted the importance of assuming responsibility. We are answerable to God, so we cannot be passive in the sustainability debate. And that's the message which, having set up Christian Ecology League 29 years ago with others, it's been a slow and difficult journey to get that basic responsibility for the planet accepted within the church. But it has been great progress, and I'm delighted colleagues from CEO and other church-based environmental groups like the Rocha are contributing to this conference. The second area for, I think, the church to act is to create motivation. It wasn't a Christian, it was an East European Greek, a bit of Barrow, who I remember hearing say, we need to have faith in the possibility of change. And as has been suggested by a range of people, and not least in a PhD I read recently on Christianity and consumption, faith can motivate behavioural change. We can, by being directed by our love of God, decide to do things which we otherwise wouldn't do. Part of that depends on our worldview, our underlying worldview. Do we see the world, for example, as something that's going to be destroyed or refined? And that depends on our interpretation of the Epistle of Peter, of course. But if we do have a different vision, if we do think the earth matters, it is truly sustainable, it's going to be transformed rather than got rid of, then maybe that will change our mindset in terms of our daily life as well. And thirdly, up here, the opportunities. We cannot change the world unless there are opportunities to change the world. And one of the biggest opportunities is for the church to change the social norms. The church is, as Sir John Houghton often says in his presentations, the largest NGO. You know, we do have, I don't know how many people go on the Sundays, a million or 2 million go to church and hear sermons, often very long sermons in my church. So there are huge opportunities for the church, as you know, ministers and preachers here, to go out there and sell the message. Of course, I've been tired enough of sermons on other topics, and I'm yet tired of hearing so many sermons on sustainability. And that helps to lead to social norms. And the reason this is particularly important is that a growing amount of work suggests that we don't make our choices in terms of behaviour as individuals. A lot of our behaviour is shaped by social norms, by social practices. And the church is, of course, if nothing else, a community. So I want to end with some questions. And I've just chosen very randomly, 2 for Paul and 2 for Anne, because I was asked to respond to their presentation, so it'd be disrespectful not to home in on what they had to say. And what I want to ask Paul is a lot of what you were talking about was about essentially monetary flows. It was models that were based on monetary flows. You were honest about that. But I wonder about whether that actually is especially helpful. I think we've done what we need to do to go to Treasury and say, look, it doesn't matter, you're still getting growth if you want it. Yeah. So does that matter? I'm interested in why the Treasury doesn't pay heed. But leaving that to one side, there's a guy who used to be head of Pettifor Waste, a guy called Peter Jones, and he said, should we be weighing the economy or measuring it? And he was talking about material resource flows, energy flows. Should that really be what we should be doing in terms of questioning what's happening to our economy? So that's the first question. Should we be focused more on natural resources rather than on financial resources? Just 1 minute, yeah. The second question is, given where you've got to, and your conclusion did suggest that the problem is people, rather than some technical economic problem, and I should immediately say that I'm not a member of the Green Party, it does suggest that we ought just to get back to party politics again, because that seems to be where the need is for change. So those are my 2 questions for Paul. For Rand, 2 quick questions. You said a lot, and I can't disagree with any really, except I just wondered, in terms of interest rates, what do we do? You showed all the maps of interest rates going up and down and the implications of deregulation. Of course, interest rates go up to try and stop people borrowing. Unfortunately, it didn't work. We carried on borrowing. But what actually do we do? 3 points or something on the real practical, radical change we need to change the banking system, the credit system, and specifically, what can the church do? You obviously point to the finger of the church, but it's easy to point fingers, and they doubt to come back to you and say, yes, Sam, but it's all difficult. So what would you then say to them? Thank you very much.
Time is pressing, so I'll call on Mawil Izzi Dien. I realise that the choreography I've actually chosen isn't the most energy efficient after all, but we'll stuck with it.
As you can see, I took off my jacket already. Right. I must say I'm honored to comment on 2 great scholars and eminent lecturers. And so a good extent, I don't know what to leave, what to include, but I mean, I'm going to be rather selective. And in a way, I'm going to talk probably about both of them at the same time. I actually wanted to obviously emphasize the fact that it came to me that both lectures complement one another. I don't want to say stand paradoxically, but I felt that each one of them has certain issues which are rather challenging and interesting. And for Pettifor, obviously I read her lecture beforehand, and I felt that her main thrust is to quote her written text that came to me, dismantle and discredit the economic theories and policies that contributed to global economic failure. So really, there's a kind of dismantling element there. And people need to drive the money lenders out of the democratic institutions. And that obviously sounds to me, obviously from an Islamic approach point of view, music to my ears. But the question that really I felt that would be extremely interesting to address is what is the practical mechanisms that can be utilized in order to achieve such an objective. I mean, I mentioned rightly the attitude of Islam with regard to usury or riba. And that was within a system which is totally different than the economic system that we know in the West, or what has developed in the modern time with regard to economics. I do not claim to be pure economist, or an economist who is specialized only in this subject. Basically, I am trained as an Islamic legal theologian and historian, and I took the issue of economics as I was going. And I felt that when we talk about sustainability from an economical point of view, is also has some kind of, if you like, prejudice. Because I would rather spoke about economics from an environmentalist point of view. Then maybe we can do or achieve more mileage with the problem of sustainability. So when we talk about economics from an economic point of view, vis-a-vis the environment, I felt that we are actually suppressing the environment and we are trying to tailor it within the dress of economics. And I felt certainly when I heard Professor Ekins, I felt very impressed by his lecture and the numbers and curves that he has provided. And I almost got convinced in what he said. And I felt that he reminded me of a very skilled tailor that I used to know in Iraq. I'm originally from Iraqi descent. We used to be able to take any suit and darn it and stitch it and provide it again in a very nice way. And once my mom took him one of his suits and he came back in a very nicely produced. And as soon as I wore it, I went to school and I saw it. And there was a big so really, I'm wondering, who is to be blamed? Is it the tailor or the garment? And I felt that we are dealing with a system, the economical system of the West, which is like the garment that I used to wear when I was at school. I think there is a need to patch lots of holes and lots of patches, and we keep patching it and patching it and patching it to an extent that sometimes we need to reconsider the material from which we are producing our garments and suits, and indeed the environment. And one of the points that I heard Anne mentioning is the position of Muslims with regard to usury, and how Muslims are going around the idea of usury in order to achieve the objectives of Islamic economics. And I felt that this is very true. I had a student of mine who just finished his PhD. He's an economist, a Malaysian economist, and he wrote his PhD in Islamic banking derivatives. And we spent the whole 3 years fighting, himself and myself. And I keep telling him exactly what I told you, that the system does not fit the other system. It's like trying to use diesel in a car which is operating on petrol. It's a different system. And if you try to force it, you are expected to have some kind of difficulties and incompatibilities, and particularly so when you come to the environment. The environment has to have its own economics, I feel. Sustainability has to have its own economics. And as soon as we start forcing into the environment our own economics and our own perceptions and our own attitudes towards it, then we are actually having the environment that is suitable for our economics, not our economics which is suitable for the environment. And we'll continue raping it, we'll continue destroying it, we'll continue misusing it, and so on and so forth. What is the reason that made Bush, the senior, Super Bush, to say, when he was asked to support the environment, he said, I am the president of the United States, I'm not the president of the world. Very well-known statement, very profound one, in fact. Because the problem is really, he's not interested in the environment, he's interested in the economics and his local economics. In my opinion, there is a need to reconsider the objective of economics, and the objectives and its values as well. Not only how we see our economics, but what value do we want for it. I might sound utopian, but resolving the problem of the environment cannot be achieved by resolving the problems of economics, which is based on materialistic, pure materialistic interests. In Islam, I really prepared a very long PowerPoint, but I think I'm going to stick to my notes, and that will save you having to go to sleep if you're on my lecture. In Islam, the idea of economics is based on rejecting the idea of labor, time, and three issues: labor, time, and the production. And all of these concepts, they are based on the idea that they do not belong to human beings totally. They are the property of the divine, the property of God. And therefore, when we plan for economics, then the ethical value comes first. That is why the usury is not expected to take place, because it is based on producing profit from a non-existent commodity or entity. And the question remains, where do we start when I speak about economics and the environment? And what the society needs? Pure materialism or value, the intrinsic value. And unless we tap within these notions and concepts, then both our understanding might be skewed. Our understanding and conclusion might be skewed. We know that most of the environmental crises are caused by economical crises. And the solution of the problem might be achieved if we take part of what Pettifor said about the idea of dismantling, an important part of Professor Ekins by stronger policy action. And that is what Muslim has been trying to apply, unsuccessfully, I must say, for the last 2 decades. And the reason for that is because they are sitting in a train, walking on the opposite direction of the train, but the train is going in its own direction. There is nothing to be achieved really. Have you ever tried to go and buy your lunch when you are sitting at the end of the train to go to the canteen? You keep running and you keep tumbling, falling right and left, and you think that you have traveled 60 miles or 6 feet, but you have traveled about 60 miles away from your own direction and objective. And I think with regard to the idea of the value, I would like to think about one of the statements that Mr. Ekins said in his answering session when he was asked about consumer value. And he said that debts became a natural matter or something natural. People want it. I want to ask this question, do they really want it? I mean, do the students want to be in debt? The development of a society who is in debt cannot be reversed without trying to start right from the beginning by establishing a society which is based on value which is completely different. The value of human being and the investment in human being in the society, rather than investing in the interests of those who owns the wealth of God, as Muslims say. I want to go quickly through one of 2 issues. One of them is the significance of environment in Islam, and obviously the significance of sustainability that will come into it. One of the problems that workers for the environment, please if my time can give me a shout because I lost time, right? One of the problems that workers for the environment face in Islam face is the fact that the environmental instruction is embedded as part of the faith. So many Muslims actually practice the environmental conservation without realizing that. But that is only on the personal level. That is only on the rituals. But when it comes to the to the active involvement in sustainability and to the complex aspect of how do you deal with the economics of the environment, then they don't know about it. And quite often it needs time in order to bring that notion to the forefront of the mass understanding. But still, it is embedded within Islam. A Muslim, before he goes to pray, he has to wash his hand and he has to conserve water. A Muslim, he should not cut the trees. Hajj itself really is considered as one of the greatest environmental celebrations in Islam. I published an article about greening the Hajj. And I was talking about so many issues about how Hajj can be green. And I had so many responses from all over the Islamic world, including South Africa. Somebody phoned me, and I said, this is great. Somebody is talking to me from South Africa, but he actually swore at me. He said, you are trying to change your faith. I said, no, why is that? He said, because you are asking that Hajj has to be green, and this is a new fashion. People talking about the green and environment, what this has to do with Hajj. And then we started talking on the phone. Unfortunately, he was paying for the bill. And we started talking about it for a while. And after a very short time, I don't know whether it's because of the telephone or not. After a very short time, he said, I see your phone, and he hung up. So I think the problem with, I mean, if you can think about 2 million people traveling from one part of the world to Saudi Arabia every year, how much footprint problem can be created? What I said rather than traveling by air, travel by ship, travel by sea. And if that is implemented, it has been, I think there are some good responses to that. That will reduce the problem of the environment. I think quite a bit of what I have to say here has been said before me when the Christian response has been mentioned really. The idea really is that Islamic theory of sustainable utilization of the ecosystem based itself on the responsible use, balanced usage of resources when they are available and not exhausting the resources. And to talk about not exhausting the resources, the example that often is seen in the book of Theology and Law is to the date palm, not to take all its dates. The honey hives, not to take all the honey and leave some of the honey for the little bees. When you milk a cow, you have to leave about 35% of the milk for the baby. These are small examples of how you can apply into the environmental issue. I'll finish with something which is really, we started very recently, well, a couple of years ago, and then I'll stop, which is environmental labeling. I think this is one of the ways that world faiths, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, can have together in order to offer some kind of tangible action towards sustaining the environment. And that is e-labeling, environmental labeling. Now, if we buy anything like that, we look at it, the contents is here. How much, what's there, saturated water, saturated fat, salt, and so on. If we can come to a point whereby we can give for every commodity in the world a value, environmental value, and we can agree on that value even in a fictitious manner. And if world faith can agree that this bottle, for instance, you buy it for £1, but environmentally, I'm sure it's worth much more than £1. All the resources, all the effort, all the traveling, all the carbon footprint, if it's put into each commodity, I think it will make a huge move forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to call on Laszlo Zsolnai now to speak.
So, less is more, small is beautiful. These are two Buddhist principles. I will keep this presentation very short. Okay. Basically, two things. One is the good news, positive things, and some correlation or consistency with the best and Paul Ekins. And the other thing is some negative news or some conflict or disagreement. The positive things is that what Buddhism suggests is right livelihood. It was also popularized here in the West and written by Schumacher and others. So right livelihood can be easily interpreted and understood in Western terms as sustainable living. I think I will show this very short. So this is the good news. But that is not good news for most of the, I don't know, most, or some Westerners is that right livelihood or sustainable living implies not sustainable growth, but sustainable degrowth. Just the opposite. I try to show that. And this is a major disagreement with Professor Ekins. However, I understand, I'm much more interested, not in Buddhist, much more interested on the physical, material, biophysical aspect of the economy. Something like Herman David. And when I say sustainable degrowth, I understand it as a degrowth of the material, physical, biophysical part of the economy. So, but I'm not quite sure, maybe in the discussion, we can clarify this a little bit, that this kind of material degrowth can be consistent with some financial growth. So, of course, you are very familiar with the psychological footprint calculations. There are some controversy about this, some criticism, of course, but I use these figures, these are the latest available figures. I use these figures just to illustrate the magnitude of the problem. The magnitude of the problem. How much we in the West overuse nature, both in quality and quantity. Ecological overshot. So we can debate the exactness of these figures, but the question is not 4% in the case of US, the overuse, ecological overshot, but 400. So that's a question of magnitude. So, but this is well known, which is more interesting, also from a Buddhist point of view. Of course, economics of happiness, sociology of happiness. I'm much more interested in psychology of happiness. Psychological, very serious psychological research of happiness. In this field, there is some very good contribution by Buddhist scholars in the US. One of the most interesting thing is that this is not just an ideology. It's material value orientation actually undermines all of value. This, in psychology, this is a well-documented evidence. So I just refer, because we don't have time, there's a paper, this famous book by Tim Kasser, the top psychologist in the US, and maybe you remember the title, High Price of Materialism. Materialism means materialistic value orientation. So this is evidence in psychology. So, and this is something to comment on this kind of a phenomenon, but Paul mentioned several times that people want more money, more profit, this kind of things. Yes, but that will be psychological and ecological consequence. So this should be this. Just a very short quote from the American weekly magazine, The Time. 4 years ago, before the economic crisis, these are my pictures, but the text is from the Time magazine. So they produced 4 years ago something what they called Global Warming Survival Guide. A collection of 50 practical points that we should try to do for the sake of survival, of climate change and this kind of thing. The last one, which is something, a concluding one, is the following. Is a direct quote from the Time magazine. They say, there is an old path to reducing our impact on the planet that will feel familiar to evangelical Christians and Buddhists alike. Live simply, meditate more, consume less, think more. Get to know your neighbors, this is Time magazine. Borrow when you need to, and lend when asked. And they refer to Schumacher, who praised this philosophy of frugality in the following way: amazingly small means leading to extraordinary, satisfying results. So this is not me, this is the mainstream American media. So turn to the Buddhist contribution, of course, you are familiar with Schumacher, which is Buddhist economics in the West. Last week we organized a huge international conference in Belgium, in Antwerp, the University of Antwerp, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of Fritz Schumacher. 2 weeks from now, in Bristol, the Schumacher Festival, Statistical will come tomorrow. So there is a Schumacher here, this year. So he summarized the main values or principles of Buddhist economics: simplicity and non-violence. Of course, he emphasized livelihood as a central ethical value, but which is really important to mention is that the middle way, concept of the middle way, which is somehow also in the West. We have this in Aristotelian philosophy. We have this kind of methodological concept, but the middle way is a very, very typical, very unique Buddhist concept. It's the middle way between the modern growth economy and traditional stagnation. That's the Schumacher. So, what is my contribution and my colleagues in this Buddhist economics research platform? We have colleagues from the US, all over Europe, Asia, Australia, New Zealand, so it's a worldwide network. So how can we interpret right livelihood? There's a lot of special ethical elements in it, in the original Buddhist framework, but I would suggest using Western economics. I suggest to understand right livelihood via these two, for us, familiar concept or aspect. One is living within ecological limits. I think in this circle we understand this very well. The other one is developing human capability approach. Amartya Sen, Martha Nussbaum, and others also analytically very developed framework. We can combine these two things and a little bit simplify. I would say that right livelihood is something like or close to what we mean by sustainable living or sustainable livelihood. This will be a little bit provocative because this compares Western economics and Buddhist economics, but it would be more appropriate to say compare Western economic mindset or ideology with the Buddhist economic mindset or ideology. So I compare worldviews, mindsets, okay, just to show the characteristic differences. So Western economics, I think, is no question, is a maximizing framework. It's a maximizing framework. All these things, what we want to maximize. Of course, there are conflicts, trade-offs, so we cannot do that, but in this ideology or this mindset, it's maximized. The Buddhist mindset or framework is something a minimizing framework. We can discuss, but you cannot say that it's the same thing, but other values should be minimized. It's not the case. It's not the case. Because it's not a zero-sum sum game. Okay? So it's a minimizing framework, and this kind of a variable should be minimized. So it's a different logic, I would say, a different philosophy, a different logic to get something good in a way to reduce or minimize bad things, negative aspects, that's Buddhist strategy. The Western strategy is to try to achieve some good things via improving or maximizing seemingly good variables. Okay, the different logic, different strategies. Very shortly, I would call the example of Bhutan. Of course, you are familiar with this case because today it is very popular. I'm working with people and organizations there. So I have some closer contact with Bhutan. But you know that Joseph Stiglitz and Jeffrey Sachs, the top American economists, just went to Thimphu to study this the Bhutanese economic model and gross national happiness framework. So this is even New York Times front page. It's very, very popular. So it's worth it to study, and of course I will just mention one or two interesting things. So gross national happiness is maybe not a good term for this kind of a framework. What is important is really a multidimensional, multifaceted approach to macroeconomic issues. What we have in the West, in ethical and social, ethical and sustainable banking, is a triple bottom line or multiple screening criteria, this kind of thing. But as a micro, it's micro approach. What they are doing, I think that's unique. They screen policy options project at the macro level, the macroeconomic level. The prime minister and the government represent it. It's the kingdom. I don't want to make any comparison about this. So the conclusion and two economic points that I finish. The first thing is that I think the Buddhist strategy is not only for Buddhist countries. So it's not a good argument that we are not Buddhist here and these are not relevant. The same is also not true for Christianity, for example. Asian countries are not Christian countries, Christianity is not relevant. It's not true. These are universal strategies, may or may not be applied in different kinds of economic settings. Two things. Thomas Schelling, the top Nobel-Prize American economist, he suggested to make a clear distinction, and this is somewhat my remark on political expert, a clear distinction between micro motives and macro behavior of the economy. Okay. Micro motives, macro behavior. I think that's a very crucial distinction. So right livelihood, sustainable livelihood, this kind of things, for sure, relates to the micro motives. Micro motives. People, communities, organizations, micro behavior. And when we discuss sustainable growth and this kind of thing, or sustainable degrowth, this is a macro behavior. It's a macro level of the system. The question is, don't share. This kind of micro motives, what kind of macro behavior generate what kind of macro behavior. So my, sorry to say, but my statement is that right livelihood or sustainable living implies sustainable degrowth and not growth. Degrowth, decroissant. French degrowth is an international movement initiated in France or Spain, and we will organize the next annual festival in Toronto, in Canada. So this is a worldwide movement, not just all countries may agree that something that degrowth can be desirable. Actually, I think it's unavoidable. I will finish with the words of Lord Keynes here in Cambridge, because he characterized the modern economic mindset in the following way, the ironic way. That's a direct quote Lord Keynes. The modern economic mindset, what is good is bad. That what is bad is good. For what is bad is useful, and what is good is not useful. That's Keynes' characterization. So I think that we should challenge this kind of economic mindset. We should go beyond that.
We've had three very rich papers, very important papers, and I also want to allow at least a brief opportunity for Anne and Paul to respond to the comments made to them. But because you've been waiting so long, I'm going to throw over the floor to you first of all, give you a chance to ask some questions, and then later on I'll give a chance to Paul and Anne to enter the discussion. So the floor is open. Who would like to lead us off? Yes.
Andy Ekins, so I should also declare, for those who don't know, I'm head of Friends of the Earth, but I am also a Christian, so I'm coming at this from both points of view. It seems to me that what we're all saying here is we need a major change in behaviours and attitudes and so on. But that we also know it's incredibly hard to do. And I guess my question to the panel is, where do you think the starting point should be? Should we as faiths be going out to talk to the wider world, or, which actually you could say is necessary to get the numbers on board with this, or should we actually be starting with our own communities, accepting that actually, in the church where I work at least, or live or worship, a lot of people are nowhere near this, within the faith group, never mind beyond. Where would your starting point be?
Okay, we'll take 3 or 4 brief questions and then I'll ask panelists to respond. Thank you. Next question.
I just want to comment on the previous session. We ended with a question of inequality, and it was not linked to the banking system of usury. But when you think about usury, it is taking money from poor people who have to borrow money and giving it to rich people. So the rich get richer and the poor get poorer as a result of usury directly. And this is why it's banned in Islam. In the Quran it says that people who lend money hoping to make it grow, they will not get anything, they will lose everything. But the ones who give money as charity, they will keep that money and will be rewarded by many-fold growth. So this, I think, sums up exactly what usury is about. Especially when you're talking about Greece having to pay exorbitant interest on their loans because they're poor, whereas big companies get lent money all the time at very low interest because they can pay it back because they're rich.
Thank you.
Paul Bottom, Christian Ecology, I think. We've heard quite a bit about moral exhortations and what they can do and how they're necessary, but I wonder if really we've got beyond the point where moral exhortations will be enough. And given that the sheer weight of pressure on people to consume through government policy, through advertising, through the whole soup that we all swim in, we've reached a point where some kind of bereavement is necessary. And really this is a question I'd like to ask of the hard-headed economists as well as the theologians. Is there really some kind of loss that has to be undergone? And how do we help people to engage with and receive really the necessity of that?
And one final.
I've got so many questions, but the one I'm going to ask is the role of microcredit, for example, with Green Bank, and people being able to borrow at a low rate of interest and small amounts of money from probably other individuals who are lending into this sort of small banking system. But if they are repaying that loan, does that not give them more dignity than if they received charity? So it's the sort of very micro level, the particularity of the individual.
Okay, thanks. So I want our four panellists to respond to all questions. So would somebody like to lead us off on the first one?
I think the starting point, I mean, we had so many starting points in this issue. From the late 60s, early 60s, until today. There are so many starting points. And many of them do not seem to be substantially effective. But there are some starting points which seems to have more leverage with regard to others. And I submit that awareness is a very important starting point. And that's why I feel that world faith can play a major stride in this starting point. I think world faith need to, and I'll be very brief, need to address 2 points here. First of all, to emphasize the points which are within their faiths that are relevant to sustainability and conservation, and make it clear to their people, because many people of faiths, I'm talking about Islam, and I think even other faiths that exist also, they are not aware that their faith, it's part of their faith, it's their duty, like praying, like going to the church, like going to the mosque. Their environmental responsibility is equal to that. That's one thing. And the other starting point really, and I really believe in that, and I don't mean offense to anybody, the environmental issue has to be an environmental issue. It should not be a religious issue. In other words, the environment should not be used for the benefit of the faith, but the faith has to be used for the benefit of the environment. I do not ask you to see how good is Islam about the environment in order to convert you to Islam. And the same thing applies to world faiths. I think this is a major starting point. And there are a lot of people in the world faiths, who use the environment and rate it in a different way by using it for their own agenda. I think this is very important.
Yes, thank you. Well, for that last point, if only people have become Christians because we're so good at looking after the environment. Yeah, I mean, two thoughts really. In terms of achieving behaviour change, it's enormously complicated, and in Britain, DEFRA have done a lot of very, very good work on looking at ways as to how to achieve behavioural change. So it's not as if it's the lack of work or commitment by the civil servants, if not the politicians. There certainly is a lot of very good work behind the scenes. As far as behaviour change is concerned, I do think that we're absolutely right in raising ecological tax reform to, if on the top of the agenda, certainly very high up the agenda in moving towards a sustainable economy. To me, it just beggars belief. This is a no-brainer. You know, in a world where we've gone back again, sorry, in a country where we've gone back again to having 2.5 million out of work. I can remember the era of Thatcherism when it went up to 3 million. It probably is 3 million now if you include the fixing of the figures. But you know, massive unemployment, and yet, when someone does something which is really helpful and useful, like employ somebody, we tax them. You know, I cannot really understand why that has been so problematic to get through to the Treasury. You would think this is the logic there. I think at the same time, I can't say I quite picked up on Paul's comments about carbon taxes, whether it was that he was worried that they're... well, I'll ask Paul to deal with the carbon taxes. Certainly my feeling is that carbon taxes have to go up, energy taxes have to rise, and probably quite markedly so. But that can only be appropriate if it goes alongside a very radical move towards progressive taxation. Because clearly the poor pay a higher proportion of their income on heating their houses and paying their transport bills and so on. So starting points will be ecological tax reform with radical moves towards progressive taxation for social equity. The only other point I'd make, in an area which I've had quite a lot of interest, is how much of onus do you put on the consumer to change their behaviour? Because one of the comments earlier was about eco-labelling, and I've done a fair bit of work on looking at the impact of labelling on behaviour change. And there seems to me, amongst the academic community, be a shift away from putting pressure on the consumer to spend even longer than they already do in those other hellholes of places, at supermarkets, trying to choose the right thing by looking at all the labels on it, even if they could understand the labels, which even I don't in some cases. And the move seems instead toward putting the onus on the producers only to supply ethically appropriate products. I did, and I'll end with this, some work for Pettifor a couple of years ago on sustainable clothing. And it was looking at public understandings and perceptions of sustainable clothing. How much do people understand about organic and fair trade and reuse and so on? And we talked a lot, and we had focus groups in a range of different parts of the country, different socioeconomic groups. And suddenly, at the end, we started talking about policy. And someone said to me, why do shops sell clothes that's unfairly traded? They actually said, well, why isn't there a leader out there? Why is the ethical fashion movement dominated by small-scale traders? Why hasn't someone like Martin said, well, everything's fair traded, we guarantee it? And it was like a sudden moment. Well, you did it with free-range eggs a few years ago, Marks and Spencer. You said we're going to take an ethical position and we're not going to sell factory farm eggs anymore. So why can't you now do it with all your clothing? And I think that is a move that we've got to look at. I'm not saying that the consumers haven't got a major role to play, but I think a lot more pressure's got to go on business to actually do the right thing, not just talk the right thing.
Just one short, but I think it's very good suggestion that I'm working in different business schools, so different European countries. So we should not forget to challenge or at least target mainstream business. So it's not the same thing that tomorrow we will speak about sustainable consumption, sustainable production, this kind of a very important macroeconomic thing. But we have Tesco, we have Walmart, we have BP, we have ExxonMobil. These are enormous power structures. And if all models, ideas are not compatible with their own models and plans, we lose. So we should have a courage, especially business school professors, I think, somehow to challenge their business models. Because otherwise it's just a nice blah, blah, blah.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Paul and Anne at this point. Paul, Tim's put a specific question to you about the carbon tax. Can I tag on to that? Two religious representatives have had a really powerful go at interest in usury, Christianity and Islam. Would you like to defend interest from any perspective you can? I mean, do you want to just respond to that basic question about the ethics of interest? And do all that in about 2 minutes. Sorry.
You said, well, I want it. The answer is no. But as you're the chairman, I suppose I have it. Carbon taxes, Tim, absolutely right. If I wasn't clear, that's entirely the way I think it has to be introduced. That carbon taxes will rise, and there will need to be redistributive arrangements to ensure that the lower income households are not made disproportionately worse off, or perhaps worse off at all, depending on your how egalitarian you're feeling. But that's the problem. That's the political problem, because that's a double whammy for the middle classes. Not only do they have to pay more in energy, and we know how much they like doing that, but they also have redistributive taxation, whereby they have to pay even more in order for some of that money to go to the lower income people. And we're out of the habit of that kind of politics. And so when I talk to policy people about that kind of politics, they can see that they think we were born on another planet. And they even have no idea what it takes to be elected in the world in which we live. Of course, these things can change. They have already changed in the wrong direction in the last 30 odd years, and they can change back again. So that's that. But it's not going to be an easy sell. On interest, well, it would be nice to live in a world in which people gave spare money to people who didn't have money. My experience is that doesn't happen very often. It does happen. The charity sector is quite dynamic, and people do give quite a lot of money. But compared with the amount of money that is lent, it is very little. And if one then says, well, if you're going to allow money to be lent, I'm not entirely sure what the exact definition of usury is, by the way, in religious terms, but I'd always thought it was lending money with interest. But I understand there may be qualifications about extortionate interest or something, and I'm not at all sure how that would be defined. Well, it then becomes an arrangement between people who want to borrow money, either because they want to set up a business to make more money, and they think they can pay it back, or people who want to borrow money to consume. And the terms on which that arrangement is entered into, I mean, we have had a huge amount of regulation, but there is still a huge amount of regulation around who can engage in activities of that kind, and on what terms. And so it's not by any means being a completely deregulated sector. But if you were to say to people, you may not lend money at any interest at all, there would clearly be a lot of disappointed borrowers, because quite a lot of people would not lend money at all. And there is the fact that interest is related to risk, as this lady said. The rich get low interest rates because it is perceived that they will pay the money back. And an absolute law of any functioning money system, given that money is based on confidence, is that you can't lend money as a debt unless you have a reasonable expectation that it will be repaid. And the less likely it is to be repaid, the higher interest you will charge. And that has operated, as far as I'm aware, in all financial systems that have allowed, usually. Perhaps it shouldn't be allowed, but I think it would be nice to hear faith movements arguing vociferously for that. But I think we heard that even from our Islamic speaker here, where that is nominally the case, a great deal of ingenuity is exercised by people who want to lend money at interest in order to get round it.
Okay, thanks.
Just small point.
Very, very brief.
The idea is that it's important to really, when we speak about interest in Islam, to identify the difference between profit and interest. Profit is the value you gain from commodities, which include labor and land, but not the capital. Taking profit from the capital in Islam is seen as giving what Anne said, a thin air value to something which has no value. The money itself has no actual value except what we have given it. And that is what Islam stands against.
That's very helpful, Anne. Before I bring Anne in, I need to take a few more questions, and I'll let Anne speak first in response. So let's have the mic ready to go. Yes, here.
Just really a question to Tim. That is about the role of companies in making change. I'm a member of the Aldersgate Group, and one of the things that we struggle with is getting governments to regulate. The basic problem is, how can one company decide to sell only fairly traded goods when their competitors don't? How do I persuade the current government to go for more regulation when they are so against any regulation at all?
As a Muslim, I'm not aware of degrowth and right livelihood. It makes sense. That's probably where my teaching would lead me if I follow it to the letter. But the problem would be how one can then persuade the politicians. Only this morning, the leader of the opposition said, if we get elected, we are going for growth. No hesitation, absolutely, we are going for growth. and everybody wants growth. But if the politicians start talking the language of negative growth or degrowth, they're cutting Hell's chance of getting elected. So the problem is, the whole growth agenda is built, the program is built into the political system. Somebody once said to me, democracy is the support structure of the banks.
Okay, I'll take two more questions and then we'll have some final comments from back. Yes.
Hi, Martin Hudson from the John Ray Initiative. I just asked all the speakers here tonight. I'm, I suppose, not totally unintelligent, but I find economics really difficult, right? And, you know, I hear Paul Ekins speak and I think, yeah, I think he's right. And then I hear Anne speak and I think, yeah, well, she's different, but I think she's right. And I go all the way through and I'm thinking, they're all right. But the problem is that it is very confusing. And what is, if you've got one thing to tell your faith community, whatever it is, what is the message of the economist to the faith community that will be simple enough for us to understand? You know, not a bit.
Ian Barnes from Melbourne, Australia. A lot of people talk about the fact that we face almost unavoidable decline or collapse or something like that. Richard Heinberg, Dmitry Orlov. So it's not a question of whether we choose degrowth or not, whether we face a period, now whether it be due to climate change and the kind of severe weather effects, whether it be due to peak oil and oil decline. I mean, there's plenty of evidence suggesting that's a realistic future we face. My question is, how do we think about the politics and economics of managing decline, not as choice but as inevitability? If it's, I mean, I suppose my question is, do we dismiss that and say that's doomsayers, or do we actually consider that as a real possibility that needs to be considered seriously?
Thank you. Just to say that I'm going to let this run for 5 more minutes. I think that's probably as late as we can stretch everybody's patience and temperature level. So could everybody be extremely brief in their answers? I'll let Anne respond if you'd like first, particularly to that question about why don't all you economists agree and make life simple for us?
I think it's a conspiracy myself, to confuse everybody, and because the more confused we are, the less attention we pay, in particular to the finance sector, and economists are very confused. I would say to Andy, the starting point has to be what the Imam said, awareness. You know, when we started Jubilee 2000 campaign, very few people understood sovereign debt and the difference between multilateral and bilateral and commercial debt. By the end of it, they understood it, and you didn't have to tell them what to do. They just got mad as hell because they understood it. So understanding and awareness is the first thing. And I just feel quite lonely in this debate because I feel that what all the contributors have discussed, and I want to say this particular about the Buddhists, because I've been reading Schumacher as well this week because of the 100th anniversary. I'm so struck by Schumacher that he doesn't talk about money. He doesn't talk about the credit system. And the credit and the money system operates almost autonomously, so autonomously that it's become this huge monster that's overtaken the real economy. Now, when we invented money, we invented it so that it would help us to do what we can do. And in the wonderful words of John Maynard Keynes, we can afford what we can do. Can't afford more than that, and we can't afford, well, we can afford less than that. But we can afford what we can do. We can't afford more. We can't afford to take more of the Earth's assets than that there are. We can't afford to work longer than we're able to work, but we can afford what we can do. But the money system has so evolved to tell us that we can't afford what we can do. So when politicians say they want growth, actually what they're saying to the population wants employment. It wants to do things. It wants to survive. It wants to be able to, people want to just engage in getting food, consuming food, keeping the roof over their head, caring for their loved ones. And the economists tell us we can't afford that. They can't have jobs, They can't have the money that will make that possible. Whereas actually they can. They can afford to look after their older parents. They can afford to look after their children. There's enough food for us all to eat. There's enough services out there for us to build places to live. But the financial system says you can't afford that unless you can pay a rate of interest of such a level. And we can't afford the rate of interest that the finance sector charges us. And that brings me to microcredit. Microcredit is, I'm deeply unhappy about microcredit. I went to India and they said, oh, we offer microcredit and we offer only 18% on our loans. Do you know what a woman has to do to her cow to return 18% of value over a year? She can't, she goes bankrupt. And that's why I think the microcredit industry is in some difficulty at the moment. So what I want to just say this, because I think I'm a lone voice here, money, and I love Paul's work, and I know Paul's work is incredibly important, and I don't want anyone to think we've fallen out here. But I am angry and I am upset that Paul can talk about his work, that Schumacher can talk about the real world without mentioning money, and the role of credit, and the role of money in making us consume more than we than we should be doing, in making us run faster than we should run in order to catch up with our debt repayments, our mortgage repayments, our rising debt repayments. So money plays an autonomous role, and it's different from the business of supply and demand, the goods and services, the trade, the thing that we're doing, the stuff that's tangible. But it has such a powerful effect. And finally, the definition of usury is what that woman said in the corner. The definition of usury is the power of those that have money using their power to exploit those without money. That's what it is, as simple as that. How do we exploit the Greeks? We lend them money and we charge them the highest rate of interest possible. We don't want to lend to the Germans. The Germans we can only charge 2% to. So we'll lend to the Greeks because we can charge them 30%. So, that is usury. That is exploiting someone's poverty and someone's inadequacies and someone's vulnerabilities in order to extract more for oneself. And we've got to manage that system if we're going to manage the rest of the economy and if we're going to manage the ecosystem. It's so fundamental. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Just to say provocatively, as somebody who on a good day calls himself a Calvinist, Calvin would have agreed with you on that.
Yes, he would. That's my problem.
Laszlo, do you want to answer the question about the politics of degrowth very briefly? We've got about 2 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm fine.
You won?
No, that's just 1 minute.
Oh, okay. And then
So
Tim.
I think degrowth might be a very attractive option in politics, not necessarily at the national level, but we have other units of politics, for example, a city, or a university, or a region.